Afternoon and good evening, everyone. Today we have Dr. Punya from Fortis Bangalore. She is a consultant gynecology and she specializes in laparoscopic surgery. And today she has chosen a topic, which is a relevant topic, and which is to give a broad overview of different kinds of gynecologic cancer. Fortis is one of the leading healthcare brands in India, and Dr. Punya is part of the team which is recognized as a center of excellence and deals with a very high volume of patients every year. So, Dr. Punya, over to you. This is your meeting now.
Thank you. Good afternoon to one and all. Uh, Thank you for the warm introduction. So, I'm a consultant gynae oncosurgeon and we do complex gynecological cases. I'm a lab and robotic surgeon at Fortis Healthcare. Uh, just a brief talk about the general gynec cancers that we have. There are quite a few of them, but I would like to highlight a few which are very common and the few which are rising in incidence worldwide nowadays, and a few cancers which are preventable and what measures we could take to prevent it rather than go and treat it. So, starting off, cancers, it's a deadly word for most of us. It's nothing but the large group of diseases which have uncontrolled division, growth, and spread of abnormal cells due to mutations that happen over a period of time. So the stats are quite bad. It's the second highest cause of mortality and morbidity. We lose more than 3.7 million cases are diagnosed annually, with almost 2 million deaths each year. So, and it is expected that this incidence will rise by another 60% in the next 20 years. So, who is at risk? Yes, anybody is at risk. Anybody can develop cancer. There was an era when we could say that certain cancers happen in the pediatric age group and certain cancers happen in the geriatric population. But now there is no such trend. Almost any cancer is seen in any age group, and it's kind of disheartening. So, and also, as we know, the risk of these cancers does increase with age due to the accumulation of a lot of mutations over the period of time. And 86% of the times we see in people more than 50 years of age. And there are various risk factors for different types of cancers. And of course, family history does play a role, but in cancer, it's mostly 5 to 15% of the population with malignancy will have a family history of malignancies. So the rest of them, bigger population, is sporadic onset thanks to the bad lifestyle that we have right now. So among the gynae cancers, we'll be discussing about the cervical cancer, the endometrium and the uterine cancer, tubo-ovarian or the primary peritoneal carcinomas, the vulvar cancer, vaginal cancer, and gestational trophoblastic diseases that occur post pregnancies. So, coming to the cervical cancer, it's my favorite topic because, and the it's my favorite topic because it's highly preventable, and we do a lot of preventive oncology works to and create a lot of awareness to people. Uh, but the sad thing is that it's the most common gynecological malignancies in developing countries, and it's the fourth most common cancer globally, with almost more than a 6 lakh new cases and more than half of it dying annually. And the most common variety that we see is the squamous cell carcinoma. But the good thing is, it is the only cancer that can be eliminated worldwide if the proper preventive measures are taken. So the cause of this particular cancer 99% of the times is a persistent infection with an oncogenic HPV and human papilloma virus. There are more than 200 varieties of this virus. Some are low risk, some are high risk, based on whether they cause cancers or not. So the ones which does not cause cancer are the low risk varieties. The high risk ones are the oncogenic varieties. So this virus is more so sexually transmitted. It need not be penetrative intercourse. Any secretions can also transmit this particular virus. And by the age of 50, 4 out of 5 women will be infected once in their lifetime. And though if they are infected, 90% of these people will have a transient infection and they resolve spontaneously over a period of 1 to 2 years. But 10% of the population will have a persistent infection who would progress to a precancer stage or an invasive cancer stage if not picked up at the right time and treated. So the type 16 and 18 are responsible for more than 70% of the cervical cancers that we have. So the low risk ones causes skin warts, which are benign, non-cancerous, but are very common, whereas the high risk ones causes not only cervical cancers but also vulvar and vaginal cancers, more than 85% of the penile cancers, and more than 70% of the oropharyngeal cancers. And in fact, with the changing trend in sexual activity, the oropharyngeal cancers are seen more commonly nowadays than even the cervical cancers. So it does affect both men and women. It causes oropharyngeal as well as the genital cancers in both men and women. So the risk factors of cervical cancers are a persistent HPV infection, multiple sexual partners, tobacco use, and multiparity, weakened immune system, prolonged use of birth control pills like more than 5 to 10 years, and poor immunity, poor diet, poor nutrition, poor lifestyle, and very rarely, less than 1% of family history could also be there. So the symptoms that people usually come to us with is persistent vaginal discharge, which is often foul smelling, not getting treated by various medications, and maybe a postcoital bleed or irregular bleed, intermenstrual bleed, any abnormal bleed which is either heavy or irregular or persistent. All this needs to give you a suspicion of a cervical cancer. uh, in fact, the most common symptom of a cervical cancer in its early stages would be no symptoms at all. So, if a patient is already coming to you with a symptom, it would already be either in the stage 2B or 3 or any advanced stages. So, the most common symptom of a cervical cancer or a precancer is having no symptom. So it is always good to examine the patient when she comes and see that you offer screening methods so that you can actually have a look at the cervix. So the other symptoms that we can expect in advanced stages are pain in the pelvis, fatigue, lack of appetite, lack of weight, lower back pain, leg pain, all of uh, unexplained weight loss. The other symptoms that we usually see in other malignancies are the other symptoms that we see. So the main thing is either persistent vaginal discharge, not getting treated on medication. That is what has to be looked for. Postcoital bleed. Always ask if she has noticed any blood on the condom or any bleeding post intercourse, and any other abnormal bleeding needs to be evaluated. So, how do we prevent? There are measures to prevent this particular cancer. It's one of the cancers which can be successfully prevented and successfully treated if picked up in the early or the pre-cancer stages. So, of course, regular checkups. And as a primary mode of treatment, we have the HPV vaccines, and we do screenings with the use of a pap smear once in 3 years. So that getting screened and tested regularly is much important, and practicing safer sexual practices is also important. So, among the screening tests, so if this is the um, path wherein a healthy cell becomes a cancer cell, it becomes an abnormal cell, it becomes a pre-invasive cancer, it progresses to an invasive cancer, then the cancer spreads and eventually the patient dies. So we have to apply the screening methods before the onset of the symptoms, and we also can diagnose early if we are aware of what symptoms patients might present with. So the primary prevention method is, of course, the vaccines which are available along with the behavioral changes in the lifestyle. So the vaccines that are available, we do have the HPV vaccines, quadrivalent and nonavalent, that are available. The best time to vaccinate is between 9 to 14 years. It can be offered both to females and males, wherein they require two doses 6 months apart. Whereas the catch-up dose vaccines can also be given from 15 to 45 years for both men and women, wherein 3 doses are required at 0, 2, and 6 months interval. And if you ask for the efficacy, it's almost 90% efficacious in reducing the cervical cancer, 80 to 85% in reducing vaginal cancer, 90 to 95 anal cancers, vulva cancers, penile cancers, head and neck cancers in 93%. Though also the benign genital warts are also reduced by 90%. And in fact, the infants who are born to the mother who has a HPV infection, in them the recurrent respiratory papillomatosis is also reduced by more than 90% if the mom is vaccinated before. The secondary method of prevention is, of course, the pap smear, the HPV DNA test, or a co-test, which includes both the pap smear or the HPV. So the pap smear can be done in two varieties. We have the conventional method and the liquid-based cytology, which is a more sensitive one. So when do you have to start to screening a patient is when if she's sexually active, start at 21. And if it is a pap smear, the HPV DNA test is started at the age of 30 years, because from 20 years to 30 years, most of the people who are sexually active would have some form of HPV infection. So it would unnecessarily cause confusions, because that might be a transient infection. So that is why we do testing of the HPV DNA only after 30 years. And till when should you do it? You do it up to 65 years. If it is a pap smear, we do it once in 3 years. If it is a HPV DNA test or a co-test which involves the pap and HPV, we do it once in 5 years. So if there is any abnormal pap smear report, once you get a pap smear report, you'll have to check for whether it is satisfactory or unsatisfactory, whether the sample was adequate or not, and also look for whether there is any abnormal cells. So any abnormal pap smear, please refer the patient to get a colposcopy testing done with or without biopsy. That will be decided based on the modified Sweet score and Reed score, whichever the center follows. And based on that, the biopsy will be taken. A punch biopsy is an ideal one. Multiple punch biopsies is an ideal biopsy to be taken. And if by chance any visible lesion is seen, do not take a pap smear. Please do a punch biopsy. So these are the various types of abnormal pap smears that you can get, and management of each varies. So coming to the pre-invasive cancers, so now we have the L-cell and H-cell, that is low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion and a high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion. So CIN1 is usually a low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion, and most of the times these are usually do not require any treatment. L-cell does not require any treatment. It just needs to be observed if the HPV DNA is negative. And HSIL, whereas CIN1, 2 and 3 belong under the HSIL, 30% of these can progress to an invasive disease in 10 years. So these needs treatment as well as regular follow-up. And 1% of such HSIL might have an unsuspected invasion also. So we do offer excisional procedures, which are fertility sparing methods like LEEP, LEDS, and cold knife conization. That can be repeated if at all the margins turn out positive. So those are the diagnostic as well as a therapeutic method of treatment for pre-invasive cancers. So if it is an invasive cancer, again we have the micro-invasive disease as well as the macro-invasive disease. Micro is when the depth is less than 5 mm. This is the FIGO staging that we follow for cervical cancer. So the treatment depends again on the stage. So if it is a CIN1, that is LSIL, we just monitor, because many of this will regress. If it is a CIN2 or 3, which is HSIL, we do excisional procedures like the LEEP, LEDS, laser conization. Sometimes if the patient is a completed family, she's old, she has any other issues with the uterus also, we can offer a hysterectomy also. But if it is a microinvasive disease, again, a simple extrafacial hysterectomy or a trachelectomy wherein we remove only the cervix along with the parametrium can be offered, or a LEEP or conization can also be offered if she's a young patient with desiring fertility. So As we all know, cancer cervix can have a bimodal age group. It can occur in its 30s in patients who are in their 30s, as well as in patients who are in their 60s. So in stage 1B1, 1B2, and 2A1, we can still offer a modified radical hysterectomy, which is a type C1 modified radical hysterectomy, which is a nerve sparing hysterectomy that we do at our center, and also with pelvic lymph node dissection or the sentinel node biopsies, both are done. So based, and if at all the patient is not fit for a major morbid procedure like this, we would also probably give chemoradiation, and it will be tailor made for each patient. So the rest of the stages will go to chemoradiation. If it is in an advanced stage with metastasis 4A, 4B disease, probably a role of neoadjuvant and role of immunotherapy has also been studied and been proven to increase the OS, overall survival of the patients, and it has been used. Coming to the endometrial cancer, these are the fastest rising cancers globally. Incidence has doubled in the last 2 decades, and globally the cases are expected to rise by another 50% by 2044, and more than 4 lakh new cases, out of which more than almost a lakh deaths occurs annually because of this cancer. So this is a cancer which is increasing because of the changing lifestyle, because of the fast foods, because of obesity, because of the non-communicable diseases like diabetes and hypertension, which are also risk factors for this particular cancer. So we do have the various types of endometrial cancer. Initially, we used to just do the pathogenetic typing, wherein they were categorized into type 1 and type 2. But we also have various histological types and various molecular markers that are available right now, and we do um, uh, categorize patients accordingly and treat them accordingly. So the most common variety that we see is the endometrioid adenocarcinoma, which is a good variety to have. And the risk factors are any high estrogen exposure that can happen during early menarche, late menopause, nulliparity, PCOS, obesity, diabetes, exogenous estrogen therapy, tamoxifen therapy that we usually see breast cancer patients taking. And when this unopposed estrogens are given, and there is no backup by the progesterones, there is proliferation of these endometrial cells, which can have a mutation and lead to atypical cells and lead to something called the EIN, which is endometrial intraepithelial neoplasia, which is a precancer of the endometrium and which can progress to endometrial carcinoma. The protective factors for this particular cancer is combined oral contraceptive pills, progestin-based contraceptive pills like the LNG IUS, and also pregnancy, because during that time the estrogens are not there. So the other risk factors are age, of course, more than 80% are postmenopausal. Genetic predisposition can be seen in Lynch syndrome. Family history of colorectal endometrial cancers have to always be asked for. And the other protective factors, of course, if there's hysterectomy, there's no endometrium, so there's no cancer. And smoking also is a risk factor. So if quitting smoking, also whether it's passive or active, can reduce the risk of these cancers. So the most common symptom that these people will come with is a postmenopausal bleed. So does all postmenopausal bleed lead to cancer? Only 15 to 30% might be cause of might be due to an endometrial cancer, whereas the rest could be a benign cause. But any postmenopausal bleed should always be evaluated. So the other symptoms that they could come with is very heavy bleeding, menorrhagia, pelvic pain, difficulty urinating, unexpected weight loss, bleeding between intermenstrual bleeding, abnormal vaginal discharge, pain during intercourse, a mass felt per abdomen. These are the various other symptoms that they could come with. But whenever a postmenopausal lady comes with bleeding, she has to be evaluated for to rule out an endometrial malignancy. And also, if there is a lady in her reproductive age group with heavy menstrual bleeding, there's always a need to do an endometrial biopsy if the thickness is increased on the ultrasound to rule out any atypical cells in the endometrium. And 15 to 20% of the time, even a pap smear can pick up an endometrial cancer. So always look for an AGS or atypical glandular cells in the pap smear. If at all, that should either give you a suspicion of an endocervical lesion or an endometrial cancer. So the first choice of investigation would be a transvaginal ultrasound. If the endometrial thickness is less than 4 mm or equal to 4 mm, the cancer is very unlikely. Further investigations might not be required. It could be an atrophic endometrium or endometriitis that causing the cancer in that lady. But anytime if there's a more than 4 mm endometrium, a hysteroscopy guided biopsy is the gold standard, and DNC can be done, or even an OPD pupil biopsy can be done. What about patients who are postmenopausal but with no history of bleeding, but with a thickness of more than 4 mm? So if such patients come, we'd still do a transvaginal scan if at all they've just gotten an ultrasound abdomen to rule out if there's a polyp, and also to characterize the lesion to see if there's a uniform thickening of the endometrium. Is there any myometrial invasion? If nothing of this is there, we'll just keep them on observation, probably do a scan after 3 to 6 months to see if it is increasing or reducing. We can we can wait up to 11 mm. So if she has no symptoms, but any lady with symptoms of postmenopausal bleeding with more than 4 mm endometrial thickness has to be evaluated by a biopsy. So once that is done, any further radiological investigations like contrast enhanced MRI, pelvis with abdomen, and PET CT can be done based on whether it is confined to the pelvis or if you suspect anything more spread beyond the pelvis. So the pathology report, the most important thing that is to be seen after the biopsy is what type of the tumor it is, what grade of the tumor it is. So the best type would be endometrioid adenosia, and the grade 1 tumors are the best to be a patient can have because these are successfully treatable. Also, sometimes there could be just a hyperplasia with atypia, that is a pre-malignant condition, which is also called EIN, which I said. So this will have a risk of progression to carcinoma, 25 to 50%. We see this particular EIN or the pre-malignant condition mostly on patients who are on IVF therapies, wherein they take a lot of exogenous hormones, and a lot of referrals come from these IVF centers saying that just before the embryo transfer, they would do an endometrial biopsy just to see if there's anything abnormal, because of course it would be thick, and then they would find that it is having hyperplasia with atypia, and they would refer to us. So usually these patients who require fertility but has an endometrial pre-cancer lesion are treated with a lot of progesterones, and we do follow them up with oral high dose progesterones as well as a LNG IUS, and then we do 3 monthly repeat of the biopsies, and if there is regression for the consecutive two biopsies are negative for EIN, then we allow them to go back to their infertility specialist and get the embryo transfer done. And once they are completed family, it's always better to go back and do a hysterectomy for them, because there would be a risk of progression or recurrence of this particular malignancy in such patients. So this is the staging of endometrial cancer. We have the 2023 FIGO staging, but to make it easier, this slide helps, wherein if it's confined to the endometrium, gone up to the myometrium, gone outside the uterus, or spread, it is staged accordingly. So like the management, I said, surgery, of course, we do the surgical staging, wherein we do the surgical staging, wherein uh, the hysterectomy, extrafacial hysterectomy, is done for type 1 stage 1 tumors. If it's gone up to the cervix, then we do a radical hysterectomy along with pelvic lymph node dissection and para-aortic lymph node dissection up to level 1 to level 4, that is up to the left renal vein. And minimal invasive surgeries are the gold standard method of surgery for such patients, especially with the endometrial cancers. Uh, so again, if cervix is involved, all that hormone therapy, again, like I said, we do it for those women who are not fit for surgery, or who are wanting to have fertility in future. And once we get the report, so we would go in and decide on the adjuvant therapy, whether the patient needs a radiation therapy or chemotherapy along with it, to reduce the recurrences rates as well as increase the overall survival rate. So the prognosis is pretty good. It's about 80% 5-year survival rate, and the prognosis, the 5-year OS also depends on what stage they were diagnosed initially. So you can see that if they're diagnosed in the early stages, the prognosis and the survival is much better. So the adverse prognostic features that are there in endometrial cancer is a very advanced age group, grade 3 tumors, type 2 histology, deep myometrial invasion, LVSI, nodal involvement, and distant mets. So all of these reflect the stage of the disease. So more the advanced disease, poorer the prognosis. Coming to the ovarian cancer, which is called the silent killer, because of course they do not have symptoms again. So most of the ovarian malignancies can either be primary tumors arising from the ovary itself, or could be a metastatic Krukenberg's tumors arising from somewhere else. So the most commonly we see the epithelial ovarian tumors 80% of the times, followed by sex cord and the germ cell tumors. So there are varieties of these tumors. Again, we have serous cystadenoma, mucinous cystadenocarcinoma, endometrioid, clear cell, undifferentiated mixed varieties under the epithelial types. We have dysgerminomas, teratomas, choriocarcinomas, yolk sacs in the germ cell types, and in the sex cord we have the granulosa, thecofibromas, and androblastomas. So usually the germ cell and sex cord stromal tumors are seen in the reproductive age group, whereas the epithelial cancers are usually seen in the older age groups. So the etiology, again, we have the incessant ovulation theory, wherein nulliparity, early menarche, late age at menopause, all these are wherein you have the patient would have had lot of ovulation. There is a wear and tear of the ovary each time the egg is released, and again the surface is tried to be repaired back, and again there is at some point there is a mutation happening, and that's the incessant ovulation theory. Spontaneous somatic mutations can happen in 85% of the cases. Subfertility treatment, exogenous hormones can cause changes in the cells. Genetic and familial tendency in 5 to 15% of the cases, and hormone replacement, unopposed hormone replacement therapy can also cause ovarian cancers. The protective factors are multiparity, breastfeeding, hysterectomy, OCPs, tubal ligation, because tubal ligation, tube is 64% of the times, tube is the source of the start of the ovarian cancer cell or an abnormal cell, and it spills on to the ovary, and that's how it starts. So tubal ligation is protective factor to reduce ovarian cancer by almost 64%. Even opportunistic self-injectomy is also a good thing to offer to the patient whenever you're going in to do either a myomectomy or a hysterectomy for a patient who's in their 40s, but wherein you need not remove the ovaries, but just offer to remove the tubes to reduce the risk of ovarian malignancies if they are not desiring fertility in future. So the causes, like age is the most common risk factor. No childbirth, nulliparity is a risk factor. No contraceptives. In fact, contraceptive OCP usage for more than 5 years reduces ovarian cancers by 50%. So women who are on birth control pills, there is a 50% reduction of the ovarian cancers. Family history, always know your family history, whether it's a close relative or a second degree or third degree. Always know what cancer they had, at what age they got it, whether it's they had multiple cancers, so that we can always link to some genetic mutation which we could fish out, and then see if these gene mutations are present in the next generations, to see if we can offer any risk reducing procedures. And lifestyle, smoking, obesity are also risk factors for ovarian cancer. Early menstruation, late menopause, endometriosis, and ovarian cysts are also risk factors. So the diagnosis, the first diagnosis, most common symptom that they would come with is usually vague symptoms like maybe bloating, gastritis, early satiety, which lasts for more than 2 weeks, and does not reduce on taking any medications. It has to be evaluated. Gastritis lasting for more than 2 weeks, please, it has to be evaluated, because it could be an ovarian cancer causing these symptoms. So most of the times they come with very vague symptoms. Persistent pelvic abdominal pain might start in a little advanced cases, and there could be an abdominal distension, bloating because of ascites or the mass itself. Pressure effects on the bladder and rectum could cause frequent urination or constipation. Indigestion, acid reflux, shortness of breath, if at all there is a pleural effusion. Weight loss, early satiety, menstrual disturbances can also occur, especially in the granulosa cell tumor, which secretes estrogens and causes postmenopausal bleeding or heavy menstrual bleeding in reproductive age groups. So, if progress can lead to back pain, dyspareunia, extreme tiredness, and all of those other symptoms. So, while examining, you might find a hard mass rising from the pelvis or an adnexal mass on a PV examination. You might find ascites or a pleural effusion on auscultation. So, there could sometimes rarely be an enlarged inguinal lymph node as well. So the investigation, basically we do an ultrasound first, and then if need be, if it is confined, if it is only one ovary and you feel it's just confined to the pelvis to one ovary, an MRI with contrast would be the best modality of radiology to characterize the lesion. But if there is any ascites, any omental stranding that is seen on an ultrasound, or if there is any bilateral tumors, always get a higher modality of investigation. Maybe a CT abdomen, pelvis, thorax, or a PET CT would be a better investigation. After that, we do tumor markers. The basic tumor markers that we do are a CA-125, CEA, and CA-19-9. But if the patient is in a young adult or in the adolescent age group, or if in the reproductive age group, we also add AFP, beta HCG, because we need to rule out germ cell tumors. If at all a patient has menorrhagia with an ovarian mass, we should always suspect a granulosa cell tumor. So, an endometrial thickening along with an axial mass should be a suspicion of granulosa cell tumor, wherein you might need an inhibin B to be done. So, always get a chest x-ray to see if there is any pleural effusion. Always, while examine for the supraclavicular group of lymph nodes. So this is the SPIGO staging of the ovarian cancers. Most 75% of the ovarian cancers come in their advanced stages. So usually, if picked up in the early stages, it's a very rare thing to happen. It's the best thing to happen to the patient, wherein if at all she's completed, her family would do a complete staging surgery. We do a hysterectomy with BSO, with total omentectomy, with pelvic lymph node dissection, para-aortic lymph node dissection, take peritoneal cytology, and do a peritoneal biopsies. But if they come in advanced stages, we, based on the performance status of the patient, we would decide to go whether with neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by an interval debulking surgery, or to do a primary cytoreductive surgery. And if we think we could achieve a CC0 or a R0 resection wherein there is no visible disease, we would also offer a HIPEC in the same sitting, and followed by adjuvant chemotherapy. So this will improve the 5-year overall survival, minimizes the recurrences, and radiotherapy has no role, not much role in ovarian tumors. It's usually the chemotherapy. Paclitaxel is the standard treatment that we use, especially in epithelial ovarian cancers. Whereas in germ cell tumors, which are commonly seen in the young females who would require a fertility sparing surgery, we would do a fertility sparing surgical staging for them, wherein we would remove only that side of the tumor, that side of the lymph nodes, and that do an infracolic omentectomy, take peritoneal biopsies, do a cytology, and probably take ovarian biopsies from the other ovary just to see what stage the disease is in. And we would also follow it up probably with chemotherapy, because germ cell tumors are highly chemosensitive and they melt with these drugs. But if the tumor burden is not reduced, it might not help much. So surgery as well as chemotherapy might be needed for these tumors. And fertility sparing, yes, it is an option in early stages of ovarian cancers in young patients. So the follow-up has to be done using when the patient comes for a follow-up. We usually ask them to come once in 3 months for the first 2 years and once in 6 months for the next 3 years, which completes 5 years. After the completion of 5 years, it will usually be an annual follow-up. We use tumor markers, we do clinical examination, we take the patient's history, and based on that, we'll decide on whether to get a simple ultrasound or to get a higher imaging modality. And of course, the 5 year survival prognosis depends on this initial stage of the disease, the age of the patient, the performance status of the patient, and the type of tumor that the patient has. Coming to the vulva cancer, it's a rare malignancy to occur on the outer genital external genitalia. So usually patients come in their older age group, more than 60 years of age. Usually in 80s, we pick up most of these patients wherein they have a persistent itching in their genital areas, or sometimes it could bleed, there could be a change in skin, it could be there could be lumps or bumps, or there could be change in the color of the skin, and sometimes also there could be pain and tenderness even in the groin region, or sometimes there could be ulcers. So the most common symptom though would be a persistent itching and pain and skin changes, which most of the times the lady would not inform at her home or anybody, because she feels it's too embarrassing to tell it out, and hence she just keeps. It's a very debilitating thing to have, because they wouldn't seek help. So the risk factors are again HPV infection, smoking, advanced age, weakened immune system, genetic and environmental factors. So the diagnosis again based on the symptoms, we ask for the history, we do an examination, we if need be we do a vulvoscopy along with a colposcopic examination as well as a vaginoscopic examination, and we would take biopsies using acetic acid, or we'd use a toluidine blue with acetic acid wash to see what areas have to be biopsied. And here also the squamous cell carcinoma is the most common type, and if need be we would take additional imaging methods like the MRI or HCT, and clinical staging is done, and the treatment is either surgery like a modified radical vulvectomy. Initially, they used to do a butterfly vulvectomy, which was highly morbid for the patient, but now we do modified radical vulvectomies along with the inguinal bilateral or unilateral inguinal lymph node dissection based on where the tumor is, what size the tumor is it a central median tumor or a lateral tumor. So based on all of that, we decide what type of treatment she requires. Sometimes a simple vulvectomy or a wide local excision itself would be enough if it is a very small tumor. So we also do something called video endoscopic inguinal node dissection. That is, we use the robot to do the inguinal node dissection, because most of the times with the conventional procedure of inguinal lymph node dissection, we see a lot of wound breakdown, a lot of seroma formation. So the help of robot has been helped to reduce these complications. So it like the field has shifted to more conservative approach, uh, uh, even in case of surgery, or sometimes it could just be a radiation or chemo radiation that we would offer to the patient based on the stage of the disease. So even neoadjuvant and adjuvant therapy also might be needed for such patients, and this will improve. Sometimes neoadjuvant therapy is used to improve the operability of the tumor. If it's a very huge tumor, we'd not be able to get a good margin if we operate upfront. So that is when we use neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So these are the most common gynec cancers that we usually see day in day out, and tried my best to give you a brief discussion of it. I'd be glad to take any questions if there are any.
Uh, Thanks, Dr. Punya, for a very informative session. I think we have a few questions in the chat. I'll read them out for you. So the first is from Dr. Innocent Zili. Dr. Innocent is from Kenya. The question is, what are the preventive measures as PCOS?
So like PCO is a very common thing that we see in most of the age groups nowadays. We usually used to see them in their 25s to 35, 40s, but nowadays I see them as young as even 10, 12 in my OPDs. The main thing is that PCO is a lifestyle disease. So, if you correct lifestyle, your hormones should be under control. So, most of the times, we do not put our patients on the hormonal pills upfront. So, what we do is we try to explain to them as to this is what is causing the imbalance. In fact, we draw them the diagrams, we tell them, okay, see, the ovary is here, there's an egg growing every month, but it's coming to the surface, it's not getting released, it becomes a cyst. If that happens every month, there are multiple cysts forming at the surface. So then we explain to them as to what is causing that imbalance, what is causing that change in the milieu of the ovary, that it's not able to release the egg, push it out. So we do take time to explain to these patients. We just do not tell her, okay, you have PCO, go do exercise. We try to make them understand as to why this is happening, so that they know the importance of having a healthy lifestyle. Healthy lifestyle not only does mean that it's either your diet or exercise, it also includes your stress management and your sleep as well. So all of this is explained to them. We'll give them a period of 3 to 4 months to do it, and along with that we do give them some form of antioxidant medications to help with the environment in the ovaries, to make it a better to make it release an egg every day. So most of the time, like 60 to 70% of our patients at the end of 3 months would come back saying that they are having regular cycles. And of course, the criteria for PCO, as we all know, there are three criteria. Even if there is no PCO on the scan, they would still be having that. So, of course, we would also check for the other hormonal issues. And upfront, when they come for the first visit, we would check for vitamin D deficiency, B12 deficiencies, and correct them parallelly along with all these measures. So, lifestyle, a good lifestyle is a better preventive thing that could prevent a PCO, is what I would say.
Dr. Punya, now we have a question from Dr. Tifle. So,
When
is fertility sparing treatment appropriate for ovarian cancer?
So, fertility sparing treatment is done only if the lady desires fertility. One thing, if she is having a early disease, as in if it is confined to one single ovary, and there is no any peritoneal deposits, there is no ascites which has any malignant cells. So early disease is what I mean, especially stage 1A disease. Even if it is 1B disease, we would see, if at all, sometimes we do a diagnostic DLAP to see if the other ovary is involved, because most of the times your imaging methods might not pick up a surface deposit onto the other ovary. So that time we would biopsy those also to see it. We would also see what variety of the tumor, if it is a germ cell tumor, if it is a sex cord stromal tumor, or is it is an epithelial ovarian tumor. Lot of considerations to be seen before offering them a fertility sparing surgery. So if it's a good variety, if it's an early stage, if she is desirous of fertility, we would offer them it, that particular thing. And also, uh, we should always tell them that, we should always offer them that there are options of egg freezing, ovarian cryopreservation, which can be freezed, cryopreserved till they complete their adjuvant therapies, because we don't want this particular chemotherapy affecting the healthy ovaries. So we do offer them that. We work in with the infertility specialist, also telling them this is what the patient has. She might need this chemotherapy, which might suppress the ovary. So we want this to be freezed, or so we explain everything. We give them an informed. We let them make an informed choice before offering the fertility sparing therapy. So it should be an early disease. It should be a good variety. Germ cell tumors, we always do fertility sparing because they are chemo responsive. And for the other tumors, we always tell that these are the various complications or things that could happen if it is not completely staged. So it has to be tailor made again.
Uh, so there is a repeat question from Dr. Kifle. Dr. Kifle is from Ethiopia. So how do we manage advanced stage cervical cancer differently from early stage?
Okay. So early stage cervical cancer can just if it's a micro-invasive cancer, stage one, A1 and A2 disease, a simple extrafacial hysterectomy or even a trachelectomy, just the surgery is enough without needing any adjuvant therapy. Whereas if at all it is a any stage between, if it's a macroscopic disease 1B, 2A, all of that, so depending on the size of the tumor and the variety of tumor, we would decide whether a surgery followed by radiation is needed. And sometimes, if the patient is not fit for surgery, we would definitely offer them radiation therapy. So, if it is an advanced stage disease, which is stage 3, stage 4 cervical cancer, usually it is chemotherapy with radiation therapy. So, usually squamous cell carcinomas are radiosensitive, and chemotherapies are given as radiosensitizers along with the radiation to make it more sensitive and for the response to be good. And if it is a stage 4 disease with distant mets, of course, systemic therapy is needed. Even after this, if there is a residual disease and if the performance status of the patient is good, we would still go back and do a procedure to remove the residual disease in the form of either radical hysterectomy or anterior exentration or posterior exentration or a total exentration based on where the tumor is and how big the tumor is. So, advanced stage cervical cancer, either neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by surgery followed by chemoradiation, or it will be a direct chemoradiation based on its response. If need be, we would do a exentrative procedures for the tumor to be taken care of.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Punya. Now there's a question from Dr. Isaya. Dr. Isaya is a gynecologist from Tanzania. So first, he is thanking you for a very nice presentation, and he would like to know how do you locate which techniques to take out sentinel lymph node.
So, sentinel lymph nodes we do in endometrial cancers as well as cervical cancer, early stage disease. So, we usually use the ICG dye, indocyanine green dye. We do robotic or laparoscopic with the 4K with the Firefly technique. So, we inject ICG onto the cervix at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock position. Within 5 minutes or before that, we would have already opened the retroperitoneal spaces, see where the external iliac vein is, open the obturator spaces, keep everything ready, and then we inject, wait for 5 minutes. Within 5 to 7 minutes, we'll put the Firefly method on, and then we would locate which is glowing. Usually, most of the times, it will be the obturator group of lymph nodes. So it is always better to first open the retroperitoneal spaces, keep everything ready, because most of the times we see people would inject the ICD into the cervix or into onto the uterus if it's an endometrial carcinoma, and then they start opening up the retroperitoneum. If at all it bleeds, then you would not be able to locate properly. So first do a good dissection of your spaces, then inject. It's okay to wait for 5 minutes, or maybe you can by then do a nexectomy or whatever. So once you see that glow, whichever lymph node is glowing the max, the first node to glow has to be biopsied completely. And it has to be sent to a good oncopathologist for frozen section, and it has to undergo an ultra staging later, so that we do not miss out on any area of micromets.
Uh,
So that is a technique we follow in our center. And in fact,
Dr.
if you're following it up in your center, if it's the first time that you're doing it in your center, it is always advisable that you do a pilot study of at least 25 cases of either of the cancers, like endometrial cancer, 25 cases of cervical cancers, wherein you need to know whether you are able to pick up the sentinel lymph node properly, whether the pathologist is able to give you a correct uh, report on that sentinel lymph node, whether it is involved or not. And after you do the complete lymph node dissection, are you missing out on anything? But sometimes we could have missed out on the sentinel lymph node, we could have picked up some other lymph node, and then the complete lymph node dissection would show that there is a node which is involved. So this sentinel lymph node might be negative. So at least 25 cases to see that you are good at picking up the lymph node, and also the pathologist is good at giving you the right report, is something which all centers have to do before using that as the method of choice.
Dr. Punya, Dr. Isaya has another question. So, what are the post-op morbidities associated with radical hysterectomy with lymph node dissection?
So radical hysterectomies again we do in cervical cancers early stage as well as for stage 2 endometrial cancers. We follow a nerve sparing radical hysterectomy, and uh, the most common complication would be urinary issues that come across, but we usually, out of 100 patients that we operate, probably one or two would have that kind of an issue, because we try to look into where that hypogastric group of plexus is running, look into the inferior hypogastric nerve, try to save it out, and not damage any of these nerves. Sometimes it might be difficult if there is a tumor getting infiltrating the nerve or stuck to the nerve. So those patients definitely do have uh, certain urinary issues, which we usually do the bladder training and all of that. So it should settle. It's all transient most of the times if good surgery is done and if the nerves are spared. And lymph node dissection usually, level 1 to level 4 lymph node dissection, apart from the complication of injuring the vessels as such during the procedure, post-op complications we have, touchwood, till now not seen even lymphedema happening. So, and also to be careful about the obturator nerve while dissecting the obturator group of lymph nodes. So, if at all it is damaged, you can always repair it, suture it with a 4060 suture, and that should be good to go. And the patient can be given a physiotherapy to uh, get back to her original state if at all the nerve is damaged.
Now we
But
have a
apart
couple
from that, we don't see, most of the complications are not seen. Like that, how we see in axillary lymph node dissection, and we see a lot of lymphodemas happening, but we do not. And we also take precautions. We give DVT prophylaxis, we use the pump, we do something called ERAS protocol. We follow early recovery after surgery. We ambulate the patient the same day. If we operate in the morning, by evening or night, the patient is out of the bed, and we give them orals within 4 hours. We start liquids, clear liquids, and within 6 hours we give them liquid diet. So most of the times, if these protocols are followed, there wouldn't be much of a morbidity, because the physiological milieu should be similar to what it was pre-op. So that is the main aim of doing the ERAS protocol.
Dr. Punya, there are a couple of thank you messages from Dr. Kifle and Dr. Isaya. And now there's a question from Dr. Ivan. Dr. Ivan is from Uganda. What is the current role of HPV testing versus Pap smear in early detection of cervical cancer?
So, like I said, Pap smear can be started at the age of 21 years, uh, but HPV testing is done at from this age of 30 years. So, Pap smear testing is looking for the cells, whereas HPV testing is looking for the HPV DNA. So even if you do just the HPV I mean, even if you do just a pap smear testing, it is normal. It's not compulsory that you have to do a HPV testing. But if a pap smear is abnormal, it's always the next step is to do a HPV DNA test along with a colposcope. So doing a co-test would be the best, wherein we see if the cells that are there are already abnormal or along with presence of a HPV. So as a screening method, either of them can be used. HPV DNA testing is done once in 5 years, so it's more acceptable by the patients. But the other thing is that it is more expensive compared to the pap smear testing. So that's a call that we'll have to give to the patient, saying that HPV DNA testing is a more sensitive one, LBC is a more sensitive one, but of course the cost also is going to go higher. But both are good. It
Dr.
depends on
Ivan,
what center.
Dr. Punya had also covered this section, about the screening. So sometime next week we will share the summary of this master class so that you can refer to those guidelines that Dr. Punya had shared. There's a follow-up question from Dr. Kifle. What is the role of imaging versus histopathology in stages of endometrial cancer?
Mm, what is the
Role of imaging versus histopathology in
in
stages of
stages of endometrial?
endometrial cancer.
Okay. So for any suspected endometrial cancer, we should always do a histopathology. So the gold standard I said was a uh, hysteroscopic guided biopsy. But if you can do an endometrial pupil biopsy, OPD based biopsy, DNC, anything is fine. So the histopathology, like I said, the grade and the type of tumor is what we look for. So if at all, if it is an endometrioid adenocarcinoma variety, I would go probably do a and if it is a grade 1 tumor, which is a good variety to have, I would probably do just an MRI abdomen pelvis if I see that it's just confined to the uterus on an ultrasound. But if I see a high grade serous endometrial carcinoma, which is a or a clear cell carcinoma, which is a bad varieties or the type 2 varieties of cancers, then probably I would do a PET CT, because these are tumors which can spread fast to the other organs. Hematogenous spreads are expected. So if the tumor is type 2 variety of tumors, better to do a full body screening. Like a PET CT would be a good imaging modality. If it is confined, if it is a good variety, do a MRI pelvis abdomen with contrast, with a diffusion weighted images, which will tell us whether it is invading into the myometrium, not invading. So that would be a better imaging modality.
Dr. Punya, I want to highlight here, like Dr. Kifle is from Ethiopia. PET CT scan, full body PET CT
Yes, sir.
scan, not available in the country. And that is the case
Okay.
in most sub-Saharan African countries, barring exceptions like Kenya or South Africa. So, in absence of
Right.
that definitive test, what other alternatives do our doctor colleagues have, as a replacement?
Yes. Is there an MRI available or a CT?
MRI and CTs are available.
Okay. So if it's a suspected early stage disease, an MRI would give us a better idea about the size of the disease, whether there's any myometrial invasion, whether there is the serosa of the endometrium is involved. So if it's a suspected early disease, an MRI with contrast with diffusion weighted images would be a good modality of imaging. But if it is a bad variety of tumor, if it is a type 2 variety of cancers, you can always do the MRI of the abdomen pelvis and probably a CT screening of the chest, sir, just to see if there's anything else picked up on the, or if there's any mets in the organs out of the abdomen. So you can always do a CT if PET CT is not available. Screening CT of the chest, thoraxes should be good enough.
Okay. Dr. Punya, you covered a very important point in your talk. Like, I have a question, though I'm not a doctor,
Yes,
but a
sir.
relevant question from healthcare perspective.
Yeah.
And probably I would want gynecologists like Dr. Isaiah, or if there is any other gynecologist to chip in. So you talked about that HPV vaccine, which
Yeah.
if administered timely, may prevent many of the cervical cancers, down the road. So how, like, then if vaccines exist, at least for certain cancers, which can prevent, what are the challenges like? Why is the world not adopting it? Cancer is a killer disease down the line. So
Yeah.
how, or like, is it new that not very widely adopted? I mean, just wanted to
So,
get a bit more on that.
yeah. So the vaccine, the HPV vaccine was invented in 2006. It was introduced to the public in 2007. In fact, the Australian government started incorporating this particular vaccination for their girls aged around 14 years in the national immunization protocol. And later in 2013, they realized that the boys needs the vaccination too because they are the ones spreading the virus when they become adults. So they included the boys also in the NIS, and by 2030 it will be the first continent to eliminate cervical cancer, or probably eradicate cervical cancer. At this point of time now, Australia apparently has no new cases of cervical cancers happening. So that shows how effective the vaccine is. One thing. So these vaccines are German vaccines that are available. So in our country, India, we have our own indigenous vaccine that we have come up with 2 years ago, which is a quadrivalent vaccine, which is available at a much, much cheaper price than what is available from Merck. But of course, we are looking into the efficacy of it. We are including uh, girls in their 14s to take the vaccine, encouraging them, creating awareness. So the the problem with countries like ours is that the population is huge, the resources need to be huge, the awareness has to be created, but the population does not accept the awareness. Not many people actually come and even sit for a cancer awareness talk. So that stigma is there. They're not ready to listen. So the government, the society, the NGOs, they'll all have to pitch in to first create awareness. The government themselves have to be created some awareness that such things exist, and we could do something, to the to the population, like, because we know that it works. It works. It helps in reducing malignancies, but it's a question that I can't answer individually. It's something the community as such has to take a call on. The government has to take a call on. Protocols
Human,
have to be made. At least in our country, we probably there are a few doctors, a lot of NGOs that are fighting to get this particular vaccine, at least the Indian-made vaccine, into our national immunization schedule, so that all of the girls, all of the boys start getting vaccinated. And as the awareness is increasing, we do see a lot of people walking into the OPD to get just the vaccines done. So it starts with awareness, though, and it's
no, I
something
mean,
which I don't
we
have an
have
answer to right now.
we have like Dr. Punya, you and I have seen it in our lifetime, right? We have had
Yes,
that pulse
yes.
polio campaign, which ran for maybe a decade, and they made the country polio.
Smallpox. Yes,
Smallpox, I think, was before you were born, and when I was a very small
before I
kid.
was.
Yeah,
Yes,
but the whole, I think that was a global campaign, everywhere. But
yes,
yeah,
yes,
we were lucky that, a lot of immunization programs were there, and, we didn't have risk for those diseases. Now, we have a very interesting question from Dr. Ivan from Uganda. Given the growing role of molecular profiling, okay,
Yeah, may I
how
ask
do
a
you
question,
prioritize?
Dr.
Yeah, yeah,
Punya?
Dr. Isaiah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad and I'm so fascinated to attend your presentation for the first time. Yeah, I want
thank
to
you.
share. And I wanted also to have a question regarding the vaccination. What I wanted
Right.
to share with my experience is that is we have most of the patients who actually attend with the advanced malignant. And in most of
Yeah.
third world countries in Africa, the issue is the shortage of resources, like you have said. And I wanted to come up with a question: is it possible if we can venture some programs on the vaccine on this part of our countries? Then the question is, how costly is it to, in terms of dollars and in terms of time? Is it required to make this vaccine in any particular area? Thanks.
So, um, so like you
Sorry,
said,
sorry, Dr. Punya, to interrupt. Dr. Isaiah, your question is like, any program, you know, it is like the scope is, I think, at governmental level, because as
yes.
Dr. Punya pointed out, that in India, we just came with the indigenous version of it. And of course, those things can be supported, but running any program has cost not only with just medicine procurement, it has many other costs like spreading awareness, building a center, training the trainers. So I think Dr. Punya may probably tell about the medicine cost, but that cost, she's not, I expect her to be a doctor, not a supply chain expert. But medicine cost from India to Tanzania would have that additional transportation cost, plus this being tied in around whole program of awareness and administering. And India is sparing, or maybe what is the our manufacturing limits. And Dr. Isaiah, we are 1.4 billion, like we are the number one populous country in the world, and huge population
Yeah, I
density.
know.
And
Yeah.
also,
Yes.
we are still studying the efficacy of the vaccine. So we need, because like I said, it was introduced 2 years ago. So we need to get exact efficacy. Probably it will take some at least another decade to give us the exact figure. But of course, since the VLPs, the vaccine-like particles, are quite similar to what is already available, based on that is what we know that it is going to be effective. So yes, it's up to the government, and yeah, that's something which
but
I
but Dr.
cannot help
Isaiah,
about, right?
Yeah,
what
just
we can
just
do,
Dr. Pun. Yeah,
what
what
Geo
I
network
wanted to,
can do. Okay, Dr.
yeah,
Isaiah, what I want to uh, place here, that we keep talking to, like, and Fortis is a healthcare brand, and the doctors, the quality of doctors there. So what we have been discussing, and I think it has to be a bigger charter. Like we started with these master classes, which serve as a bridge between Indian consultants and African doctors participating, building a dialogue, exchanging ideas. What we are also doing it, and it has been discussed in multiple master classes, like Dr. Rishikesh Pai, who has been one of the early pioneers in IVF and all those reproductive treatments. Then there was Dr. Biswarup around cardiology, along valvular heart diseases. And similarly, in these gynecology, what I gather is timely identification, running training programs. So I will discuss this with you more. But what I'm confident is, if we can do something center around your hospital, the institution where you work at, a deeper training program, I think Fortis management would be very supportive of any such initiative. So we
okay.
can do that. Now, I interrupted you. Please go ahead. You had a follow-up question also.
Yes, I wanted to know the cost of maybe one ample per how many patients, in terms of when you purchase instead of synthesizing, because synthesizing it is costly for in terms of time and in terms of dollars that will spend
Mhm.
making it. How, if we choose the whether the Indian or the Australian vaccine, how much does it cost for a single amp and for how many people to be vaccinated?
Dr. Punya, you may have that information.
Mm, So currently, Indian vaccines are being given only in India. In fact, for me to procure the Indian vaccine, so the thing is, 60% of the vaccines that are manufactured are going into vaccinating girls from the through the government. Only around 40% is available to the other hospitals, like the corporates, the private hospitals, so that majority of these are pooled into giving vaccines to the underprivileged population who would not otherwise come up to the healthcare facility to get themselves vaccinated. So those are the target population that our country is prioritizing as of now. um, so procuring it to an other country, I am not sure if that will happen as of
No,
now.
so
So the
just what's
market
the
price
cost,
for
ma'am?
this particular vaccine as of now is at 2,000 rupees in Indian rupees, whereas the Gardasil 9 that we see is around 10,000 rupees. So it's much cheaper price that it is available, but compared to the quadrivalent, it is half the price. Like 4,000 is what the Gardasil quadrivalent is available at, whereas ours is around 1,800 to 2,000. So it's at a 50% lesser price, but we are giving it free for those who are in the age group of 14. That is the rest. That is the 60% of the vaccines are going into that.
Okay,
So
let me. I mean,
I'm
Dr.
not sure if that answered your
Isaiah
question.
will not understand in terms of Indian rupees. So, Dr. Isaiah, what
Yeah.
you're saying that those
Yeah,
German vaccine variants, they cost around 4,000 for one ampoule, 10,000 Indian rupees, which is around roughly you can say $110. Like
yeah, sure.
they range from 45 to $110 per ampoule, while the Indian variants they range from 20 to $22 per ampoule. So it is like half or one fifth of the German variants. And Dr. Punya, one ampoule is for one person.
Yeah. It's
Absolutely.
just zero point 0.5 ml. So
Just 0.5
one
ml, just
ampoule
for
is
one
for
person.
one person.
And how many doses does a child need? Like,
So, like I said, the best time is 9 to 14. If given in that particular age group, it's just two doses and there is no booster doses required. The two doses will be 6 months apart. So, that gives lifelong immunity. But if given anywhere between 15 to 45 years, then it would be three doses at 0, 2 months, and 6 months.
and Dr. Isaiah, like in I think organization like USAID, CARE, there are multiple development organizations like that. I'm sure the governments must be considering procuring some of these vaccines and carrying out a mass immunization program, because whether it is normal Indian population or normal African population, I mean, these immunization cost would put a lot of burden, financial burden on families. So I think many times there are government or those humanitarian drives which cover this. I don't know. We'll have to find out, Dr. Saya. But
Oh,
what?
thank you.
Yeah.
She already covered all my questions that I asked. Thank you so much, Dr. Punya.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I think no. We have one question left, Dr. Evans. Given the and after that we can conclude the session. I will overshot by roughly 20 minutes. So, given the growing role of molecular profiling, how do you prioritize patients for targeted therapies where access is limited?
So, of course, molecular profiling, we categorize all patients, all endometrial cancer patients now has to go through the molecular profiling. We categorize them into the four varieties. So, if at all she is pole mutated, then even if it is a high grade tumor, her prognosis would be good. So, probably I wouldn't uh, add multiple modalities of treatments. Probably a surgery with radiation would do, even if it is a high grade, because the prognosis, if it is a positive, would be good. So the other thing is, if it is even like P53 is positive, I would see that she gets the chemotherapy on time and all the 6 doses on time. If need be, the radiation also would be added as an adjuvant therapy to reduce the recurrence rates and to increase the OS. So to add the hormone therapy or not, again we look into the ER and PR status. So hormone therapy as such in all ovarian endometrial malignancies is not a very common thing that we give, but of course targeted therapies are being studied, and again it depends on what variety of the tumor it is. So not all varieties get targeted therapy. So the first basic therapies that they have to get is what we plan out for. Only if in case of recurrent settings or an unusual varieties, we do give them targeted therapies. But where access is limited, I think uh, these uh, conventional therapies that we have been following should also be good enough, because targeted therapies, of course, we are giving as a maintenance. So if you have the facility to keep monitoring them and the facility to pick up a recurrence earlier, so and treat it accordingly, that should do. But wherever facilities are available, maintenance therapy, targeted therapies are a good choice for a certain set of population only, not for everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Punya. I think we can conclude the session now. And thanks for a very detailed and informative presentation. So normally, what we do after the event, we share the event recording with those doctors, with the doctor participants, and also we share a document, based on the transcript that we have discussed, sort of a reference document, so that they can follow. If we have your permission, we can also share your presentation with them so that they can refer.
Sure,
Need
sure,
your
sure.
permission.
Yeah.
So thank you all. Thanks for taking time out on a Sunday, and thank you, Dr. Punya. Thanks a lot. We hope that we
Thank
will
you. Thank
we
you
will
for being a great audience.
we will
Thank you
get
so
to
much.
some session with you a couple of months down the line on some relevant topic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.